The honourable member for Little Bow, followed by Edmonton Mill Woods.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government's cold-hearted cuts to vulnerable frontline services continue. The PDD Day program in Southern Alberta provides high-needs clients with jobs within their limitations and helps them give them a sense of purpose. The Premier even did a photo op at this facility during the election last year in Coaldale, but now programs like it are being cut and millions are being wasted on plush new MLA offices and special services for healthcare insiders. To the Associate Minister of Services for Persons with Disabilities, why do you swing an axe at the frontline programs of the most vulnerable citizens of Alberta?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for the question. It's a good question representing his constituents and concerns that he's heard out there. I can tell him the concerns that I share, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we haven't cut any programs yet. We're shifting away from community access programs towards programs that produce better outcomes, community inclusion, community engagement, and employment programs, Mr. Speaker. How that impacts any particular client out there, we haven't yet determined, but we're going to do that very carefully, Mr. Speaker.
There was a web seminar on Monday saying that you're going to close all these programs. That's why people are concerned. Mr. Speaker, again to the same minister, given the Southern Alberta has especially high need rates of people with PDD clients, and given that you clearly haven't done all the homework for these various employment challenges that exist, when are you going to suspend these cuts, do the proper assessment of the programs that are needed in my region?
Mr. Speaker, my budget saw an overall increase, though modest, this year. This isn't about cutting. This is about shifting to fund programs that produce better outcomes and better care for the clients that we have in the system, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, again to the same minister, given that parents of these PDD clients have contacted me and they're worried they're going to have to quit their jobs to look after their adult children, what can we say to assure them? Or are you going to reassess your cuts and the needs in my region, and or are you going to just keep putting vulnerable Albertans at risk?
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. We're not putting vulnerable Albertans at risk, nor are we going to evict, as some members over there have suggested, persons indeed and throw them back to their families or put them on the street. That's wrong, Mr. Speaker. But here's something for the member to ponder over the weekend. We're talking about implementing a difficult budget, doing some difficult balances with a modest increase in the budget. Think about what happens when you cut a couple $2 billion out of the system, how difficult the decisions that you guys would have forecast in moving forward. Mr. Speaker, we are moving to increase and provide better care for the individuals, for vulnerable Albertans out there. We'll continue to do that.
Mountain View, followed by Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, the Premier said, I quote, "We will make tough decisions, but they will be responsible. They will ensure that we are protecting vulnerable people," end quote. Jody is a mentally disabled mobile adult who supervised community activities get her out of her basement for volunteering, group activities, and exercise. They've eliminated her need for antidepressants. Because of this government's poorly planned cut of $45 million for community access to PDD, Jody's meagre opportunities will be severely reduced. To the Premier, will the Premier stop insulting Albertans and their families who are disabled by portraying these cuts as improvements when all Albertans recognize
the Honourable Associate Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I pointed out in a previous question, the overall budget for disability services did in fact increase, although modestly. Nonetheless, we have there's always difficult decisions to make when you are talking about the care of vulnerable Albertans. What I did commit, and we did not cut that budget completely, what I did commit is those people that rely upon community access supports, that need them, that are identified in their assessments, will still get those supports, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me go to the Minister of Human Services then, who's dodged these questions repeatedly. How can the Minister be seen as anything but irresponsible in forcing these drastic cuts in 3 months? He's clearly out of touch with our most vulnerable and their families.
Honourable Minister of Human Services.
I would answer that by saying, how can that honourable member be so irresponsible as to scare vulnerable Albertans when the answer is very clear. There will be a plan for each one of those Albertans, and if they need those services, they'll continue to get those services. But we're working to better services for vulnerable Albertans, for better outcomes for vulnerable Albertans. That takes time. The Associate Minister is working with those families, and our department is working with those families, and it's absolutely irresponsible to scare those vulnerable Albertans by any other comments.
Working with the families doesn't mean listening to the families, Mr. Minister. Given that you want to increase employment and post-secondary for the severely disabled, which is impossible for people like Jody, and given that Alberta Works has cut $100 million from employment programs, post-secondary has taken more drastic cuts, how is this not irresponsible? Are these ministries even talking to each other?
Honourable Minister.
What's irresponsible, Mr. Speaker, is to lump every single disabled Albertan in the same can and say these cuts are going to affect all of them in the same way. What we're doing is responsibly looking at each particular program, at each particular individual and each particular individual's needs, and saying how can we get better outcomes for those people. And yes, we are working with enterprise and advanced education with respect to how we get skilled levels up. And yes, we are targeting our resources so that instead of devoting them to the advantaged Albertans who have the opportunity to get good jobs and a good economy, we're targeting them at those who have barriers to success so that they too can participate in our
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Shaw, followed by Calgary-Fort.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our most vulnerable continue to be impacted by this government's mismanagement and inability to communicate. The decision to shift away from community-based supports to outcomes-based supports may be a positive thing, but the minister has admitted to not knowing how this system will impact any individuals in the PDD system. With no planning, no consultation, and no feedback from those who will be directly impacted by this government's decision-making, how is the minister going to determine which supports will be cut?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there's so much in that preamble that is just absolutely incorrect, and very obviously we're not proceeding anywhere without some very thoughtful planning and working with our partners, and that's exactly how we're going to continue to do it going forward, Mr. Speaker. That's just ridiculous.
Honourable Member.
Check the Hansard, Minister. You admitted it last week. But given that the lack of communication with caregivers and families has resulted in anxiety and insecurity in communities across this province, when will this minister find the courage to advise parents, guardians, clients and staff which specific programs will be cut as of July 1st?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are indeed working with parents and families and service providers across the province, and over the coming weeks we will be travelling the province to visit with each and every one of them. And, Mr. Speaker, the changes that we're trying to do are a logical and correct transition in services that we provide there, and we in fact have the support of the service providers. I recognize that there's a transition issue. I'm doing everything I can to manage that, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member.
Given that this government has a history of ramming through decisions without proper consultation, and this minister has imposed an irresponsible and offensive 3-month deadline to current contracts without communicating what to expect after July 1st, when will the minister have the new outcomes-based contracts in the hands of our service providers and advise families what supports their vulnerable loved ones will receive?
Honourable Minister.
As I indicated in the last question, Mr. Speaker, I recognize there's a transition issue here, and we do indeed have some trepidation in the service community out there and with some parents, and I'm working on that. We will ramp up our communications efforts. We will have contracts in place, Mr. Speaker.
Members, we have a point of privilege, I believe, that has been noted here by the Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona. I have points of privilege first and then points of order. Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona, did you wish to proceed and outline your case for urgency?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I was just checking. Oh, okay. So thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pursuing a point of privilege today under Standing Order 15. I'm pursuing this point of privilege on the grounds that my ability and that of all opposition members, in fact, to participate fully and fairly in second reading around debate around Bill 20, an Appropriation Act, has been unjustifiably hindered by the actions of this government and therefore infringe upon my privileges as an opposition member. I also have some reason to believe that this will continue in the Committee of the Whole process and also in third reading unless a remedy is achieved. Mr. Speaker, there's no more important function for an opposition MLA than to hold the government accountable to issues of public expenditure. Please allow me to explain the nature of the actions in particular and touch on why I believe they relate to privilege. Essentially, Mr. Speaker, yesterday the opposition, several members of the opposition made repeated requests to representatives of the government caucus that different opposition members be allowed to speak to Bill 20. In response, the government allowed one member of each opposition party to speak once before the government majority was used to adjourn debate in the afternoon. And then in the evening, the government brought Bill 20 back to the floor with just enough time for one member of each opposition party to speak again before the issue had to be voted on under Standing Order 64 sub 3 at 10:15 p.m. Through this strategy, Mr. Speaker, roughly 4 hours of debate opportunity was lost to members of this Assembly. In other words, by using its majority to adjourn debate at will, the government effectively prevented up to 20 opposition members and a number of government members from having the opportunity to participate on debate in Bill 20 or on Bill 20 in second reading. Now, as it is, Mr. Speaker, as I'm sure you are aware, the government has previously used its majority to bring in our standing orders. And as I'm sure you are aware, we already have what some people might characterize as time limits or what others might even characterize as closure as a result of Section 64 of our standing orders, which limit or put a maximum amount of time that the appropriations bill can be debated. And indeed, as you know, the bill can be debated for a maximum of 1 day for each stage. So now this new practice of the government, one that I've only seen in the last couple of years and to greater and greater degrees this year, this new practice of the government to further limit debate by significantly limiting the amount of time allowed for budget debate within each of the 1 day where we're allowed to debate, in my view, represents an excessive use of its majority by the government caucus. Now, as for timeliness, Mr. Speaker, you did indicate to the member from Beverly Clareview that he could not anticipate the actions of the government and use that as the foundation for his complaint with respect to privilege. So as a result, we had to wait until indeed what we anticipated would occur did occur, and the matter was brought back by the government with near the very end of debate yesterday evening, such that second reading was completed with very little time in between the first adjournment or with almost no time between the first adjournment and then the last 40 minutes or so in the evening. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, there's no more important function for an opposition MLA than to hold the government accountable to issues of public expenditure. House of Commons Procedure and Practice, second edition on page 819, states that, and I quote, "The direct control of national finance has been referred to as the great task of modern parliamentary government." Page 820 of the same volume recognizes the fact that, quote, "Parliament must assent to all legislative measures which implement public policy, and the House of Commons authorizes both the amounts and objects or destination of all public expenditures." Now, as the Speaker knows, the Parliament consists of all elected members, not just the government. And of utmost importance to the role of Parliament is the role of the opposition in debating issues of public expenditure. Pursuant to this, at page 831 of Procedure and Practice, it states that the House of Commons recognizes two contradictory principles, Mr. Speaker. One is that the government is entitled to get its financial legislation through Parliament, and two, that the opposition is entitled to identify, draw attention to, delay and debate items that it feels needs attention and discussion. Marleau and Montpetit on pages 66 to 67, of course, speaking to the issue of privilege, state that, quote, any disregard of or attack on the rights, powers and immunities of the House and its members is referred to as a breach of privilege and is punishable by the House. Erskine May, 22nd edition on page 108, states that, quote, any act or omission which obstructs or impedes either House of Parliament in the performance of its function or which obstructs or impedes any member or officer of such House in the discharge of his duty, or which has a tendency, directly or indirectly, to produce such result, may be treated as contempt, even though there is no precedence of the offence. Moreover, Beauchesne's page 3, section 1, describes the principles of parliamentary law, and it states, Mr. Speaker, that they are, quote, to protect a minority and restrain the improvidence of tyranny of a majority, to secure the transaction of public business in an orderly manner, to enable every member to express opinions within limits necessary to preserve decorum and prevent an unnecessary waste of time, and to give abundant opportunity for the consideration of every measure and to prevent any legislative action being taken upon sudden impulse. Mr. Speaker, it is my assessment that Standing Order 64, which essentially places a very significant time limit on debate of second reading for appropriation bills, is in place and more than meets the principle of orderly execution of business and avoiding any unnecessary waste of time. Those principles that I just referred to in reference to the quote from Beauchesne's. However, for there to be no unnecessary waste of time, there needs to have been an excess of time spent on the issue to begin with. And in this case, there was almost no time given to the issue, which is the cause of my concern. Both myself, as well as another member of my caucus, were given no opportunity to speak to Bill 20 in second reading. In total, 6 of 26 opposition members were allowed to speak to Bill 20 yesterday. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's important to note that while estimates provide an opportunity for opposition members to question the government on issues concerning the budget, they do not afford the opportunity to engage in parliamentary debate. And I know, Mr. Speaker, that what we will hear from the other side is, oh, well, you got 55 hours or whatever of estimates debate, notwithstanding the fact that we've already had a conversation here, Mr. Speaker, around the fact that the amount of hours for estimate debate was significantly limited to the opposition by this government in a previous decision. But notwithstanding that, Mr. Speaker, this is different, because Bill 20 is the one, or the opportunity to debate Bill 20 is the one forum in which we are given the ability to debate the combined impact of the budget as it relates to all the departments of this government. There is no other such forum for us to talk about how, well, maybe this cut here is okay, but when it's added up with all these other cuts, it's really not so okay. Or, if I were a member of the Wild Rose Caucus, what I might say, well, maybe this increase in funding right here is okay, but when added up with all these other increases in funding, it's not okay. So there is a principle, Mr. Speaker, that the budget as a whole requires debate, not just the line-by-line, ministry-by-ministry discussions that we have in estimates. And that is the debate, Mr. Speaker, which this government has limited significantly. They've already, as I've said, have the benefit of Section 64, but by using their majority to adjourn debate and then not bring something back, they've actually, as I said, on second reading itself, limited the debate by about 50%, roughly 4 hours. So, Mr. Speaker, parliamentary democracies often see arguments over the principle of respect for the rights of the minority. Beauchesne suggests in Section 3 that it is there to preclude, quote, a government from using to excess the extensive powers that it has to limit debate or to proceed in what the public and the opposition might interpret as unorthodox ways. But, Mr. Speaker, if almost no time is given to the opposition to debate Bill 20, then we must surely conclude that debate has been limited to the most excessive level achievable, and that of almost no debate, with all due respect to the 6 opposition members who were given the opportunity to engage in debate. Similarly, this also calls into question the principles of every member expressing their opinion and having the opportunity to engage. In this case, I am arguing that the government is using its power of majority to unjustifiably and excessively limit debate on a matter that is of the utmost importance to this House and goes to the very heart of our roles as members of this Assembly. Mr. Speaker, the standing orders which are put in place to ensure that excessive debate does not occur are there. Moving forward the way I've just described, I would suggest and I would argue amounts to an abuse and a fundamental breach of privilege. That is why I'm bringing this to your attention now, so that by your good judgment you can find a prima facie case of breach of privilege in this matter, and a remedy can be sought before the rights and responsibilities of the opposition to debate matters of public expenditure have been completely trampled upon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your consideration of my points.
The Honourable Member of Calgary-Curry, followed by Calgary-Buffalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week during the constituency break, I had the opportunity to speak with several of my constituents regarding PDD funding. Many are worried that these cuts may have serious real-world impacts on them, their family members, and their lives and their quality of life. All of my questions are to the Minister for Services for Persons with Disabilities. How will the $39 million cut to community access affect my constituents who are concerned that this cut will deny them the basic opportunity to participate and be a member of their community?
Honourable Associate Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to respond to that. Mr. Speaker, we discussed that we are going to reduce community access funding in favour of services that provide more inclusive, more engaging opportunities in the community, like employment, Mr. Speaker. I can tell you right now, while that transition is in place and assessments are undergoing, nobody who needs services will be denied services, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that cuts have been made to post-secondary training institutions like Mount Royal University for their social work program for disabilities, how is the Minister going to ensure that the difficulties that organizations are already having regarding staffing are not multiplied, compounded?
Honourable Associate Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we do have a strategic plan in place to deal with workforce issues in disability service workers, and a big part of that was a 10% wage offer that we made this year. We do have a strategic plan going forward, developed in concert with service providers and post-secondary institutions. It's posted on our website for comment right now. I am actually deeply concerned about the cuts in post-secondary institutions. We had a sign language interpreter program at Lakeland and a disability service worker program at Mount Royal. I'm concerned, and I will take that up with the Minister of Advanced Education, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that many organizations are concerned with the July 1st deadline to submit revised budgets, and that this is a very aggressive timeline to initiate change with caring for the vulnerable Albertans that we have here, will the Minister consider extending this deadline?
Honourable Associate Minister.
Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Speaker. At the moment, we are working towards that very deadline. We are working collaboratively with service providers, PDD agencies, caregivers, guardians. I recognize completely there is a concern out there at the pace of implementation. I also recognize I'm not going to have success unless I work with people, and we'll see how the transition goes, Mr. Speaker, but I am absolutely prepared to be flexible if I have to be.
Ready North, followed by Calgary-Fish Creek.
Hey, Mr. Speaker, there are many concerns across this province for the residents of Michener Centre and Red Deer North who will be transferred to new homes in the community. Some parents of the 125 residents are pleased that their loved ones will be repatriated back to their home communities for care, but other parents and guardians have serious concerns about moving their loved one. Mr. Speaker, I've been assured that each resident will have an individual plan developed for them with the assistance of their family and caregivers. I understand that a resident will only be moved once their parents or guardians agree to the plans. I also understand that every effort will be made to move residents with their friends whenever possible. To the Minister for Persons with Disabilities, residents and staff have been told that it's been mandated that...
Honourable Associate Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think I caught the tail end of that. I was trying to watch the member there, and relates to whether or not there's a mandate for the public, for residents that are cared for by the public guardian to be moved first. That is absolutely not the case, Mr. Speaker. The public guardian represents a number of residents there, some with lesser needs and some with more profound needs. Every patient in there will be moved in accordance with an individual plan agreed upon, developed with, in fact, the staff, our department, and their guardian, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member. Perfect.
Thank you. To the same minister, will parents, guardians, residents and caregivers be able to participate in developing the plan for their loved one, and what will you do if a parent does not agree to the plan that is being developed?
Honourable Associate Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I spent a good part of last week actually meeting with families from the Michener Centre, and we've had some difficult but productive discussions going forward, and I'll continue to do that, Mr. Speaker. Every individual in that place will have a plan for their particular needs developed and an appropriate destination identified as a result of that. From there, parents or guardians will have choices about what the best pathway for their loved one will be, and I will guarantee that we're going to work with every individual before they're moved. No one moves until there's a place for them, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member.
To the same minister, given that Michener staff are very concerned about the residents first, but secondly, more than 400 staff are concerned about losing their jobs, what kind of supports will be available for the staff, some of whom are near retirement?
Honourable Associate Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I have to say that the staff have been absolutely exceptional in very difficult circumstances, more difficult because of the planning at the individual level that needs to be done. We can't identify what some of the staff impacts will be right now, so it's a difficult time for staff. Despite that, they have pledged to be involved in the care plans for individuals, which is absolutely exceptional and speaks volumes to the great people that are there. Mr. Speaker, once those care plans, appropriate destinations are identified, we'll be able to work with staff. We can absorb some in AHS in our own program. At all times, Mr. Speaker, we'll be working within the collective agreement, and people will be dealt with dignity and respect and gratitude, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member Calgary Fish Creek, followed by Lesser Slave Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Associate Minister PDD is having a tough time selling his plan to cut $42 million in a program spending for the most vulnerable citizens. Frontline workers are worried about how they'll deliver quality care, and our clients are worried about how the cuts will affect their standard of life. Now we hear about a new gag order, which is being imposed on all PDD frontline workers and service providers that threatens them against speaking out without prior consent from your government. The culture of fear and intimidation is being used to muzzle frontline staff like they did in AHS. Why is the Associate Minister adopting it to silence the people caring for the developmental disability?
Honourable Associate Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if the member's assertions were true, I'd probably be equally concerned about them, but in fact they're not. We've got a draft contract out there that nobody has signed yet that's available for open comment. In fact, we're having a forum with service providers next week for everybody to comment. We're trying to standardize a contract on our side that deals with children's services and our needs. That clause came from Children's Services. It's out there for open comment. If anybody has a problem with it, I'm pretty sure they'll identify it in an open forum that we have next week. We're trying to work collaboratively, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member here.
So, Minister, will you guarantee this House there'll be no muzzling of frontline staff?
Honourable Associate Minister.
Well, I think I've been through that, Mr. Speaker. Overall, we have a budget increase. We've moved some money out of community access supports. We want to move more towards employment supports, and we gave a boost of 10% directly to frontline staff, Mr. Speaker.
Here. Honourable Member.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask that question one more time. Minister, will you guarantee that there will be no muzzling of frontline staff or service providers?
I apologize to the honourable member. I misunderstood the question. There was something probably on our side, not theirs. But Mr. Speaker, I will guarantee, first of all, that people that need services will get them, and second of all, those contracts will be fashioned so they meet the needs of frontline providers and the government. I don't know right now where that clause is going to wind up, but if there's a clause in there, it's for a good reason, to protect people's health information or whatever else. There will be no muzzling of frontline staff to talk about issues in care, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member on to Cardston Tabor Warner, followed by Erden.
Speaker, this past constituency week, I was able to meet with persons concerned about the PDD program, and I have the requisite number of copies of 29 letters of concern from parents, providers, grandparents, siblings, community members concerned about the announced cuts and changes to the PD program. I also heard from a pharmacist concerned with some things in his letters here. The oxygen supply changes that are being made are a concern to Mr. Jantz and Mr. Clemens. And then the parent preschool program, Southwestern Alberta, invited me to meet with them, and they gave me 4 letters from Naomi Weeb, Kathleen Van Herk, Chelsea Jensen, and Nicole Levin. I'd like to table those. Thank you.
Harry Shaw, followed by Fort Saskatchewan Vegerville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2008, PDD Board started a pilot project known as the Supports Intensity Scale, or SIS, a tool intended to evaluate the support requirements of a person with developmental disabilities. The SIS places a value from 1 to 7 on a variety of criteria to determine the support an individual should need. My question for the Minister is very simple. True or false? When the PDD boards introduced this to service providers, caregivers, self-advocates, families and clients, were they assured that the Supports Intensity Scale would not be used to determine funding?
Honourable Associate Minister.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I can't speak to the conversations that are held back then. What I can tell the honourable member is that's not the sole determinant of funding today.
They're here.
Given that many organizations and families would dispute your claim, Minister, including my own parents, when did your ministry advise service providers, caregivers, self-advocates and families that SIS would become the tool for determining funding?
Mr. Speaker, the Supports Intensity Scale, pretty much as it describes, is a tool to determine supports intensity, need, Mr. Speaker, based on assessment of need and an understanding of what the person's circumstances are, natural supports, those kinds of things. That's what determines funding.
Honourable member for there.
Well, given that roughly only 2/3 of PDD clients have had a personal SIS interview to date, will you ensure, Minister, that every PDD client has an individual SIS completed before implementing your changes that are merely 7 weeks away?
Mr. Speaker, actually over 80% of the PDD clients in Alberta have had an assessment already, and we will be through most of them before the July 1 and the rest of them very shortly thereafter, Mr. Speaker.
Edmonton Highlands, Norwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. An honour and a pleasure for me to introduce Brenda to you and to all members of the Legislative Assembly. Brenda is the mother of a son totally dependent on PDD supports and deeply troubled by the cuts both to day programs and group home services, his only opportunity to get out and recreate and find a quality of life. She's also concerned about the inappropriate pressure on her and her son to get him out to work. Brenda is particularly concerned about broken promises of this government that will create more suffering for the most vulnerable in Alberta. Honourable members, I'll ask Brenda, she's standing already. Let's give her a warm welcome from the Legislature.
The honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona, followed by Fort Saskatchewan Vegerville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have 2 sets of introductions. First of all, it's my pleasure to introduce to you and through you my guest Judy Cabral and her 2 sons, Jeff and Jared. Judy is very concerned about the cuts being made by this PC government to PDD services across the province, as both Jared and Jeff's quality of life depend heavily on these services. Jeff is part of SCAN, the Supportive Community Access Program, which is an adult day program that provides employment support and recreation opportunities, and Jared receives support from the Elbs Memorial Special Needs Society. Both of these programs are absolutely crucial to providing Jared and Jeff with the support they need. I would now like to ask Judy, Jeff and Jared to receive the traditional warm welcome of this Assembly. My second introduction.
Shaw, followed by Bonnyville Cold Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the alternate reality this PC government operates in, a tax is not a tax, a raise is not a raise, a decision is not a decision, and now we learn that a cut is not a cut. In Calgary last week, despite cutting $42 million from community access programs, the Minister of PDD suggested that he, quote, will not take services away from people that need them. I'm sure the Minister can understand the confusion amongst many Albertans. Will the Minister please explain how he can possibly guarantee that everyone who needs support will still receive it after he personally signed off on a $42 million cut to frontline services?
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for being in Calgary last week and for meeting with many of the concerned citizens there. I imagine while he was there he didn't share any discussions about $2 billion that they would plan to cut out of their budget, Mr. Speaker. Nonetheless, Mr. Speaker, that member was present when we did estimates, and it's pretty clear, I thought, in estimates that my budget went up by $3.5 million to a total, I believe, of $694 million, Mr. Speaker. I was also very clear in the budget discussion that we plan to transition from community access services to community engagement services, including employment. I stand by that promise. I also said that people that need services will get services.
This is nothing short of a broken promise from a Premier who promised no service cuts. Minister, given that you continue to insist the $42 million gap in funding will not take services away from our most vulnerable, are you actually suggesting that there are people in the system today that are receiving services who do not require them?
Well, we are currently doing needs assessment, Mr. Speaker, and that could well be an outcome of the needs assessment. We'll have to wait and see. But people that need services will get services. End of story.
This minister has insisted that he will fill the $42 million gap with an additional $2 million out of his employment budget. Can't the minister see that $42 million and $2 million just don't quite add up?
Mr. Speaker, I can't say it more clearly. We are going to do a transition from community access supports to supports that provide for inclusion and engagement in the community, including employment supports. And we do have budgetary money on the human services side for employment supports, and we will focus employment supports. But I'll say it again. People who need supports will get supports, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member from Strathcona, followed by Airdrie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, we knew the Premier had broken her promises to Alberta's most vulnerable citizens, but we didn't know the full extent of the damage. Now, service providers in the Northeast PDD region have been notified of a 40% cut overall, a deeper cut than anyone could have imagined. Mr. Speaker, in the North at least, this is about far more than day programs. This is about basic life supports. So will the Associate Minister admit that his terrible cuts are jeopardizing the basic safety and well-being of persons with disabilities in Alberta?
Honourable Associate Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the member was present during the estimates, 6 hours of estimates in front of committee, and during the votes on the budget in this House, and the member is very well aware of what my budget is going forward, and she's well aware that it actually took a $3.5 million increase. She's also well aware that we were crystal clear. We are going to transition from community access supports to supports that provide better inclusion, better engagement with the community. Mr. Speaker, the providers in the Northeast, we are working collaboratively with them, and we are discussing numbers. Nobody has a contract. Nobody is aware of any cuts. I most certainly will not admit that we are doing anything to jeopardize health.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. Honourable Member.
Well, Mr. Speaker, given that there's a memo out there that says the overall Northeast PDD budget of $23 million has been slashed by $9 million, not the $2 million that you suggested would be the case in estimates, and given that service providers have told us that they are going to be forced to cut 24-hour supports, eliminate one-to-one aids, and move people from group homes into unsupervised apartments in that area, will the minister tell us how his decision to cut 40% of funding to Northern Albertans with disabilities is not a complete betrayal of his responsibilities and a dereliction of duty?
First of all, Mr. Speaker, I never said any such thing in estimates. I didn't know then, and I don't actually know now what the actual regional. I don't know what the actual regional budget allocation to the Northeast PDD will be, Mr. Speaker. I can tell this honourable member that her fear-mongering here is not going to be helpful in the discussion. Across this province, service provider, PDD organizations are in support of what we're going to do, Mr. Speaker. The difficulty, I would like to state an answer, honourable member, if you would allow me to. Across this province, there are service providers and PDD communities that agree with the transition that we want to go through. The difficulty here is the speed of the transition, and I am absolutely sensitive to that, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to try to work with it.
Mr. Speaker, it's not fear-mongering when there's documented evidence of what the cuts are. Now, given that funding to one particular Barrhead PDD service provider is being cut by nearly 50%, putting supports for all 68 individuals under their current care at risk, and given that the CEO of that agency has told us that 65 frontline workers will lose their jobs if this PC government doesn't come to its senses immediately, will the minister admit that he's created utter chaos for disabled Albertans, their families and frontline staff, or is he so out of touch that he can't see or won't let himself know what his connections are or what his decisions are doing to people on the ground?
Well, I know very well, Mr. Speaker, what impact the spending by my department has on people on the ground, because I've been out there listening to people on the ground, not watching phantom emails come over the system, Mr. Speaker. And I will continue to do that. In the next 2 weeks, Mr. Speaker, I'm in 20 communities across this province. In the next 2 weeks, I'm in 20 communities across this province listening to what Albertans have to say, Mr. Speaker. I'll say again, the service provider that she indicated does not know exactly what their budget will be. They do not have a contract at this point, and they're dealing with half of the equation. They don't know what other services we are planning to provide, and we'll get there, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Edmonton Centre, followed by Cardston Tabor-Warner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Actually, the tablings I'm doing today are on behalf of my colleague, the member for Calgary-Buffalo. The first is an email from people actually currently in California, but writing through people in Cochrane. And that's Joni and Brad Stenning, care of Ernie and Marie Evans, and they are concerned about the cuts to PDD because their brother Mark Evans is cognitively impaired and feel that he benefits very much under the programs under community access. So I'll table that. I also have an email to Calgary-Buffalo from Gary Simpson, which was CC'd to me, which is expressing great disappointment in the 56% cut in funding for students taking courses from Alberta Distance Learning, which he feels is defeatist. Next is to Calgary-Buffalo from Tammy Johnson regarding cutting support programs for people with disabilities. She is a person with a disability working and contributing to the community and appreciates, she's very fortunate in what she's had, but doesn't want to see people, other people subjected to poverty and difficulty. To Calgary-Buffalo from, B. Curley, also raising concerns about seniors and the proposed pharmacare program. This person is afraid that as seniors they will have to provide for the likelihood of a worst-case scenario. It's quite distressing her to think that she could be looking at a possible decrease in benefits. To Calgary-Buffalo from Jason Walker with concerns about the PDD cutbacks. And he has worked with persons with disabilities and is really struggling to understand why those supports would be taken away from individuals like those he's worked with. And finally, an email to members, directed to members of the Legislative Assembly from a Ben Graham in Calgary. He has also worked in the field of disability services and is bringing on the concerns about the proposed cuts affecting services. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
With Cardston Tabor-Warner, followed by the Minister of Human Services, and then Highwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proof that the law of physics that states nature abhors a vacuum is also true of human nature. And when programs or changes are announced, people without enough sufficient information, they fill in the blanks. And sometimes they're drawing conclusions according to the government that aren't justified. Nevertheless, because of the lack of information regarding PDD and how it's going to impact people, I continue to receive many letters and calls, 2 examples of which I will table today in addition to the many others I've already tabled. One from a concerned mother who describes the help that her son is currently getting and hopes that it will be allowed to continue. She desperately hopes that. Another is from the principal of the McGrath Elementary School commenting about the programs that are currently run by SASH, the Southern Alberta Society for Handicap, and the good work that they're doing in this school and the esteem that the kids are, these workers, the people that are being helped, are receiving by being able to do this work. So I have the requisite number of copies and would like to table them with you today.
Ministry's loyal opposition, second main set of questions.
Got mold and asbestos in the kitchen, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government is undertaking a massive restructuring of services to persons with developmental disabilities. And understandably, the families affected are nervous about what the changes will mean and how their loved ones will be impacted. The minister attempts to smooth things over with calm reassurances. But it rings hollow because the minister's only answer to all the specific questions we've been asking is, in essence, trust me, it'll be fine. To the Premier, assuming there is a plan, how can such sweeping changes affecting so many vulnerable Albertans be so poorly communicated and so badly managed?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't agree with the premise of the member's question. Actually, they are well communicated. This is the implementation year of changes that have been going on and agreed to since 6-7 years ago with the service providers, the families, the agencies, PDD, everybody else. So here we are, Mr. Speaker. Yes, there are some nervous parents out there. There's some nervous caregivers out there. I'm traveling the province. I'm in 20 communities in the next 2 weeks, and we're working through our issues. I can only say again, Mr. Speaker, if you need care, it will be there. If you need services, they will be there.
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, letters have gone out to a number of organizations who provide PDD services that they may not be funded anymore, effective July the 1st. A lot of organizations are in smaller centres where resources and alternatives are scarce. So does the minister have other organizations lined up to take over these critical services for PDD clients as of July the 2nd?
Mr. Speaker, in the interests of openness and honesty, we have talked about potential worst-case scenario numbers with some of the providers, and some of them are nervous. We do not think we're going to lose any providers. I was just in the Northeast today talking to service providers. We don't think we're going to lose any. We're going to achieve contracts, and this will be fine.
The answer to that was no, Mr. Speaker. The minister thinks that his promise that everyone who needs services will get services is going to satisfy clients and families and staff, but it won't. He's traveling the province soon, as he mentioned, in another example of after-the-fact consultation. But isn't it a better idea to get it right before implementing sweeping changes, rather than going around the province on a PDD apology tour?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is in fact right. We have a different idea of what consultation is. We're out there talking about the facts. They're out there talking about conjecture, Mr. Speaker.
Here, here. Honourable Medicine Hat, followed by Fort Saskatchewan-Begerman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government's Cuts Today programs for vulnerable Albertans are causing fear and confusion. A resident in my constituency doesn't know what she's going to do with her adult son after these cuts take effect. He has Down syndrome, diabetes, and celiac disease, and he wants to enter the workforce, but simply can't without the added supports from frontline groups that are being cut. The PDD minister's cross your fingers and hope for the best approach is a failure of leadership. Will the minister admit that he has botched this service transition, delay the July 1st deadline, and make sure Albertans' fears are addressed?
Mr. Speaker, I think I pretty clearly signalled that we're out there working with the service providers, talking to them. We're talking to families as well, and I understand the concerns are out there. We believed that we could achieve a July 1st deadline, and in some respects I still believe that. But I also said pretty clearly in here and out there, Mr. Speaker, that we need to work together with the service providers. I clearly get that transition is an issue, and I'm working on it, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, Given that the minister was practically booed out of a recent meeting in Calgary because he couldn't provide essential details of his transition plan, can he now fill us in on where he is taking these programs, or is he just making it up as he goes along?
I was not practically booed out of a meeting in Calgary, Mr. Speaker, and I don't recall accidentally wandering into a Wild Rose meeting, so I'm not sure what the member's talking about.
Honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, given that this minister's best response to the pending July 1st changes is, quote, "We'll see how the transition goes," does the minister not realize that his own lack of confidence and planning is causing a world of distress and worry for Albertans affected?
I absolutely do realize that, and I think I just said that a minute ago, Mr. Speaker. I absolutely do realize the concerns that are out there, and we're working to address them. I've talked to a heck of a lot more people than that honourable member has, and I will continue to do that. We're going to work with people, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member. Side. Thank you, Associate Minister for Services with Persons with Disabilities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to inform this House and Albertans of the situation we face in our efforts to provide supports to persons with disabilities. Mr. Speaker, we're all beginning to hear from parents or guardians who believe they will see significant cuts in services for their loved ones. They believe, Mr. Speaker, that service reductions are driven by the resources available within the disability supports budget. This is evident in questions asked in this House, in concerns expressed by my colleagues, in the communities I visit, and in the letters and emails I receive. Mr. Speaker, we are not adjusting services to individuals because of fiscal capacity identified in the budget, though clearly we have signalled that we intend to change the form and the purpose of the supports we provide. Changes in service levels, increased or reduced, will happen as a result of the fact that we are able to assess need, and we're going to allocate services based on need. Mr. Speaker, we are currently doing assessments of need for all of the individuals we support based upon the Supports Intensity Scale, SIS, or SIS as it's called. Those assessments show that there are a number of individuals whose support levels are greater than their measured need would indicate. I do not mean for a second, Mr. Speaker, to make light of their circumstances or to indicate that they do not require any support, but I do mean to highlight that there are people who get supports beyond what is needed. Mr. Speaker, the SIS system identifies the needs of individuals on a scale of 1 to 7, with Category 1 identifying those with low support needs, Category 7 indicating extraordinary behaviour supports are needed. We're finding that a number of individuals who are currently receiving significant supports do not appear to have the needs that such support levels would indicate. Many of them fall within Category 1. And among those, Mr. Speaker, who fall within Category 1, we are currently providing an alarming range of services, from one individual who receives $114 per year in supports to one individual who receives just under $300,000 per year in supports. This clearly underlines the fact that for some individuals, the supports are currently allocated based on reasons other than need. I cannot support such a model, Mr. Speaker, because it's not defensible or sustainable. People who need services have to get services, but we cannot provide services beyond need. Added to this reality, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that there are certainly real transitions identified in the budget. We intend to move from an emphasis on community access supports to an emphasis on supports that provide for inclusion and engagement in the community. As a result, service providers who offer supports are hearing that they could face contract impacts, sometimes significant ones, Mr. Speaker, as we move to renew contracts. We are working collaboratively with service providers, so some of them have seen potential dollar figure impacts that are indeed very significant. These service providers are concerned, and they have expressed their concerns to parents. They have suggested that they may not be able to offer certain supports in the future, and that heightens the anxiety. I understand these concerns, Mr. Speaker, and there is actually another side to this story which I will discuss shortly. But first, I wish to further underline the scope of the support situation. This has to be dealt with, Mr. Speaker, because I need to ensure that we provide supports to people who need them and that the system is sustainable. Consider this, Mr. Speaker. Based on information from Statistics Canada, there are about 430,000 Albertans who have some form of a disability, something that serves as a barrier. About 100,000 of those rely on natural and community supports, or they have found ways to engage and belong without assistance. They get no support, and they do not request any. But there are about 330,000 people who have a range of more moderate to severe disabilities who may have barriers to employment or community engagement, Mr. Speaker. 330,000. Our current disability services funding provides support for 25,000 people, or less than 10% of that population. Some of that population may not need support, that's true, but many do and actually are currently asking for it. Yet they are often excluded from the system because of their inability to access programs or because of entrance barriers, like the IQ test. This is not the right or the responsible way to provide services, Mr. Speaker. The right thing to do is to provide supports based on need. That need first has to be fairly and impartially determined by conducting a scientific, internationally recognized assessment, which is what SIS is, Mr. Speaker. SIS does not fully consider the individual circumstances, and because of this, it cannot be used as a sole determinant of funding. But it is a credible measure of need. We will use SIS and factors like personal circumstances to determine service allocation, Mr. Speaker. The supports have to be considered on the basis of need. But they also have to be provided with compassion to people who we clearly understand are vulnerable. We will do so, Mr. Speaker, and ensure that there are appeal mechanisms for assessments and for service decisions. I do need now to talk about the other side of the story that I referenced earlier, Mr. Speaker, when I talked about the impacts to service providers. At this point, the providers had not actually seen a new contract, Mr. Speaker. They do not know what impacts they face. When we implement the changes to the community access supports, there will indeed be impacts, Mr. Speaker, but they will not be as severe as has been suggested. We are now working at the individual provider level. We are working on a way to ensure the impacts to a provider are more manageable during this transition. To accomplish this, we will access supports from the budget in human services, and we may yet require additional support, which I will seek if necessary, Mr. Speaker. This is going to be difficult, but at this stage I believe this goal can be accomplished. But moving forward, we will continue our transition from community access supports towards supports that provide more engagement and inclusion in the community. Service providers who wish to contribute to this transition will find ample ways to do so, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we could not do this without them. This transition will ensure that persons with disabilities who can work, who want to work, including volunteer work, Mr. Speaker, will have the supports in place to help them do so. We recognize there are people who cannot benefit from such supports, who require community access supports as their only way to engage the community. The supports will be there for those that need them, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that is a situation and the work we need to undertake. We have much to do, not the least of which is to finish the SIS assessments. This must be done in order to determine need going forward and to begin the work of allocating services based on that need. This will be difficult, Mr. Speaker, and I signal that now. But we will transition this in a caring and compassionate way. We will not begin by withdrawing services. We will begin by having conversations with families and guardians and together finding a solution. So, Mr. Speaker, I have described the difficult structural issues we face today and the significant amount of work that needs to be done. I am confident that we can make the changes we need, and I'm going to drive hard to do so. Because in the coming years, Mr. Speaker, the goal is to make further transitions. In the coming years, I would like to remove the artificial barriers that currently exist at age 18 and 65. Transitions that disrupt lives while often adding no value to supports. I would like to remove the IQ test that prevents so many individuals from accessing supports that would allow them to pursue their goals, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have been mandated by the Premier to provide services and supports to all persons with disabilities through a system that provides for supports based on need, that provides a continuum of supports as people age and change, and that provides supports in a compassionate manner. I am also mandated to ensure that the support system is open, transparent, measurable and accountable, Mr. Speaker, and it has to be sustainable. I am honoured to take that task on and, with the partnership of an incredible group of dedicated individuals in the Department, this will be done, Mr. Speaker. I make that promise, and I am prepared to be measured by it. I will make one more, Mr. Speaker, though I've already made this one. If you need services, you will get services. End of story, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. The statement from Calgary Shaw in response.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for attempting to clarify what your planned reforms to PDD funding will mean. Unfortunately, I don't believe this statement provided any clarity at all, and it's an unfortunate reality that the Minister felt that he needed to deliver this ministerial statement at all. The Minister's remarks must be understood in the context of the fear and anxiety many Alberta PDD families have over the impending July 1st transition of services.
Hear, hear.
For months, this minister has pushed the transition on those who receive PDD supports from the province with precious little in the way of detail of how it will go. Understandably, Mr. Speaker, this is causing tremendous worry for families of vulnerable individuals who have come to rely on these supports. In many cases, these supports are what allow them to thrive. I can't tell you how many Albertans I've talked to who are terrified of what this government's ill-defined transition plan will mean for their loved ones, or how many frontline employees would gladly forego their so-called wage increases to ensure those they care for daily do not have their supports cut. While attempting to reform the system to serve clients better is a worthy pursuit, doing so with blinders on, as this government is doing, is a recipe for disaster. Mr. Speaker, this minister talks about the ongoing assessments based on the supports intensity scale, an interview based on hypothetical scenarios, and how those outcomes will determine what supports an individual receives. But to illustrate just how badly this transition has been handled, PDD families were promised the exact opposite. They were told the SIS assessments would not determine funding for supports. They were ensured the SIS was simply a pilot project. My own parents, who helped care for my sister who receives PDD support, were told exactly that. And now here they are, along with thousands of other PDD families and caregivers, awaiting the results of an interview and finding out which number between 1 and 7 they will be assigned to determine which supports they will get. Minister, you are reducing people's lives to a number between 1 and 7, and for some unexplainable reason, you don't see a problem with that. Mr. Speaker, this PDD transition is simply following in the footsteps of so many PC policy failures. It has been under-consulted, poorly communicated, and rushed ahead despite warnings and red flags from everyone impacted. This government, it is government knows best at its worst, Mr. Speaker, and this time it's hitting our most vulnerable. I, along with many Albertans, was hoping to hear something more substantial from the minister today. I was hoping for some long-promised clarity and solid evidence that supports will not be lost, as the minister so often likes to remind us. Instead, I suppose Albertans will just simply have to take his word for it. But given what this government's word has meant of late, I'm sure you can forgive them for being a little skeptical. Thank you.
Honourable members, ministerial statements and responses to ministerial statements are similar to private member statements. It's not customary to heckle each other during them, and it's certainly not customary to interrupt them when they're being delivered. So if we could please remember that, that would be helpful. Secondly, I've received a request from the third and fourth parties to join in this discussion and to offer their brief comments. That requires unanimous consent. Does anyone object to giving them that unanimous consent? If so, say so now. Did we hear an objection over here? We heard no objection, so let us carry on then. The Honourable Member for Calgary Mountain View.
Mr. Speaker, it has become a recurring theme with this government to act first and deal with unanticipated effects as they arise. From dramatic health care changes to inadequate seniors care policy to First Nations policy and now persons with developmental disabilities. Decisions are made without proper research, consulting, and review of best practices. And then a critical piece, Mr. Speaker, examining the process of change. Change that will minimize the pain of change. This government is now trying to placate PDD clients, their families and service providers with half-truths and assurances that everyone will be better transitioning to a new needs-based service delivery model with a, quote, greater focus on achieving positive outcomes, end quote. I ask you, Mr. Speaker, positive for PDD clients and their families, or positive for this province's bottom line? Why can we not, in 2013, learn from the boom-bust nature of our economy and provide stable, sustainable support for essential human and government services? Our most vulnerable have been speaking out loudly and clearly for decades. They are fearful because of this government's erratic and inadequate supports. They are jaded because they have faced chronic shortage of service. They are tired of not being consulted. They are angry when not having their concerns heard and acted upon. The Alberta Association for Community Living, Alberta Council of Disability Services, Alberta Disability Workers Association have all joined together against these rapid and dramatic changes. Make no mistake, this new service delivery model will negatively impact PDD clients and their families in real ways, ways that the rest of us have no understanding of. The least our government can do is to ensure stable, dependable funding, proper consultation, and careful, thoughtful implementation of change to improve care for all vulnerable people. Persons with developmental disabilities deserve the very best we can give, and they're not getting it, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Opposition.
I appreciate that the Minister has taken the time to try and offer additional information to explain the rationale behind his draconian cuts to services for people with developmental disabilities. However, his statement is profoundly disappointing, Mr. Speaker. First of all, he refers to the sports intensity scale as somehow demonstrating that a whole bunch of people are receiving services that they don't need. However, I must remind members of this Assembly that over 2 years ago, when I first raised the impact of the SIS, I was assured by at least one and possibly two different ministers that this new assessment tool would not be used to cut services to people who currently receive them. I was also assured that the limits imposed by IQ tests would be removed at the same time that the SIS was implemented. It is now very clear that these assurances amount to yet another broken promise by this PC government. Indeed, this government started by cutting services. They did so when they chose to take at least $42 million out of the budget for PDD. And let us be very clear, Mr. Speaker. The minister continuously tries to confuse the issue by suggesting that because his overall budget went up ever so slightly, that he is not reducing services. This is simply not accurate. His budget went up for two reasons. First, he needed to fund his partially kept promise to increase salaries for frontline workers. Second, he needed to find $10 million extra to fund his arbitrary decision to close Missioner Centre. Once those two new expenses are factored out, his ministry actually lost money, a lot of money. And this money is coming at the expense of community access support. The notion that you can somehow increase community inclusion through employment while cutting half the money that would assist in this revised focus is ludicrous, Mr. Speaker, and the minister knows it. In addition, the minister suggests that another rationale for his cutting this community access by almost half is that there are a whole bunch of other disabled Albertans who do not receive funding through PDD. Now this, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely true. But if this was actually an issue about redistributing the resources more equally among a larger number of eligible Albertans, then the money would not have come out of the system. It would not have been cut. Indeed, if equal access to resources was really the issue, Mr. Speaker, funding for PDD would be increasing, not decreasing. Yet it did decrease, Mr. Speaker, by at least $42 million. And as I stated last week, in some areas it looks like the cuts may be even greater than was initially predicted. The Alberta Council for Disability Services said that the total cuts to the Northeast region are close to $9 million out of a total budget of $23. If these cuts were just to community access, the number would have been closer to $2 million. Instead of just having 40% cut to community access, the Northeast is facing a 40% cut to their whole budget. These cuts mean that not only will Albertans with disabilities in the Northeast region lose support to attend community programs, but many will lose essential services. Some high-needs individuals will be losing necessary one-on-one staff support, and others will lose residential care or overnight staff support as organizations lay off nearly half of their staff. These are draconian. The government needs to do the right thing. They need to restore trust and funding.
Thank you, honourable member. I want to provide just a little bit of clarification to Sylvan Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to introduce to you and through you to all members of this Legislative Assembly some guests of mine in the gallery. They're here today to raise their concerns regarding the government's plan to close Michener Centre and the continued devastating cuts to PDD services. They're upset that the government has broken their promise, and they have brought with them thousands of signatures, which I'll be tabling in the House today. Here today are Jenna Baines, Lee Kvern, Jody Kvern, Russell Clark, Andrea Benoit, Angie Pala, Lorraine Strand, and Christine Yarjo-Becker. I thank each of them for their advocacy and ask that my honourable colleagues provide them with the traditional warm welcome of this Assembly.
The honourable member for Edmonton Beverly Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise today to introduce to you and through you my guests Aaron Waite, Jane Myatt, and Beverly Hills. Aaron, Jane, and Beverly are part of a group of hundreds of Albertans who have come here today from all over the province to protest this government's cruel cuts to PDD services. These are services which are in place to protect some of the most vulnerable citizens of our province by giving them the support they need to lead happy and successful lives. The fact that the government of one of the wealthiest parts of the world would even consider cutting such services is incomprehensible. I would now like to ask Aaron and Jane and Beverly to stand and receive the traditional warm welcome of this Assembly.
The honourable member for Edmonton, honourable leader, third main set of questions.
Well, the minister will get another question about that a little bit later, Mr. Speaker. The minister responsible for persons with developmental disabilities spent a long time in the Assembly yesterday attempting to reassure everyone that his planned changes to the delivery of services will work. But it is another government failure evidenced today by the big protest rally outside. The Alberta Association of Community Living, Alberta Council of Disability Services, and Alberta Disability Workers Association represent almost everyone who's involved in PDD. They are joining together to ask the minister to stop. Why won't he listen to the voices of the people who are most affected?
Actually, Mr. Speaker, I've met with all of those organizations, and I met with individuals out there today. And I'm going to continue to do so and to meet with people. I made it clear in my statement yesterday, I've made it clear out there in the province, that we clearly understand there's an issue with transition and an issue with the overall funding. And as I did make clear in my statement yesterday, I'm working on that, Mr. Speaker.
The organizations I mentioned represent PDD clients and families, service providers, and support staff. They point out that this is the largest cut ever imposed on people with developmental disabilities in Alberta's history. They also point out that PDD funding reductions are based on an arbitrary formula that will impact the lives of thousands of vulnerable Albertans. We've made the same arguments for months. When will the minister listen and do something about it?
As I said, Mr. Speaker, I am listening. First of all, as I explained in my statement yesterday, what people perceive to be cuts is because they're looking at the disability services envelope. They're not looking at the other side of. If the Mr. Speaker, could I finish my answer? Thank you. If they were aware of what supports are available on the human services side of the budget, and my commitment to ask, well, they don't want to listen to the answer, Mr. Speaker, so I won't give it to them.
Leader, would you like to try again?
Mr. Speaker, the drastic changes could lead to a PDD crisis. The families are warning the minister. The clients are warning the minister. The workers are warning the minister. The agencies who deliver the services are warning the minister. The opposition is warning the minister. He ignores us all just to placate the Treasury Board and their misplaced priorities. When will he do his job and stand up for the needs of Alberta's most vulnerable?
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, that is exactly what I'm attempting to do. And in order to do that, you have to get down there and listen. Now, I didn't see any of the opposition members doing that today. They were at the microphone pandering and telling people how they're going to be all things to all people. You've got to get down on the ground and listen to people, Mr. Speaker, and that's what I've been doing. I will continue to do. I'm in 20 communities over the next 2 weeks. The meetings are on the internet. I invite people to come out and talk with us. We'll do this as much as we can over the coming weeks and months, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Edmonton Highlands Norwood, you rose at a point of order at 2 o'clock, and so did Lac-Liberty St. Paul Toohill, so we have 2 points of orders raised between 2 and 2:01. They'll be addressed later. Let us move on to the Leader of the Alberta Liberal Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last election, the Premier campaigned by promising honest and transparent government, that she would listen to Albertans, and of course, no service cuts. Promises made, promises broken. To the Premier, how does starving programs that help persons with developmental disabilities and patients requiring palliative care meet your promise of no service cuts?
Honourable Associate Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think that the question is to me. I'm not aware of a specific case. I'm not sure I know what the member is talking about. If he'd care to enlighten me, I would caution him, of course, about talking about any individual's health care situation.
Let's move on, then maybe we'll get it in the supplemental.
Doesn't want to answer that.
Mr. Speaker, it's the minister's $42 million cut to his program. It's beyond ridiculous for this government to pretend that they have not cut services to persons with developmental disabilities and those requiring palliative care. They're not fooling anybody, Mr. Speaker, except themselves. And what they are doing is hurting a lot of vulnerable people. These are not expenses to be cut. These are real people that need real help. To the Premier or whoever wants to answer the question, will you please look up from your spreadsheet and realize that persons with developmental disabilities and patients requiring palliative care are not line items?
Mr. Speaker, I have been clear, and I will continue to say that if you need services in our province, you're going to get services. For that honourable member to lump palliative care and persons with developmental disability services together it doesn't really make sense to me. If he's got an individual case that he would like to make some progress on, then I invite him to do so in the proper way, Mr.
Mr. Speaker, this government missed math class. They promise no service cuts, they cut funding, cut staff, and then they say they're not cutting services. Mr. Speaker, so many groups, including doctors, nurses, post-secondary students, staff and faculty, correction officers, municipal leaders, and now First Nations, have all voiced concerns over this Conservative government's heavy-handed approach and lack of consultation. To the Premier, and yet again any other minister, how can Albertans view this as anything else but an abuse of your majority to bully into submission anyone who doesn't agree with you?
Mr. Speaker, this government and this Premier has always been very clear that we will deliver the services that we have been entrusted with, and we are doing that just very well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But we have also been very clear that we will be very prudent with Albertans' finances, and we are doing that just as well, Mr. Speaker. So we will not have the opposition lecture to us what they would do, because every day they change the tone and they want to be everything to everyone all the time. As a government, we actually have to make decisions and be accountable for them.
The honourable member for Calgary-Fish Creek, followed by Edmonton Riverview.
Mr. Speaker, this out-of-touch government continues to target our most vulnerable people. The Association for Community Living, the Council of Disability Services, and the Disabilities Workers Association are all calling the minister's $42 million cut to PDD the largest in Alberta history. Worse yet, they are warning that these dramatic cuts will throw the community into chaos and crisis. All the while, the minister has the audacity to insist these cuts will not impact services. Minister, how can you possibly guarantee that these vulnerable Albertans won't lose services as a result of these shameful cuts?
Mr. Speaker, I think I need to ask the member to revisit the fact that, in fact, the disability services envelope has not been cut its whole. In fact, it increased by $3.5 million. In addition to that, I identified in my speech yesterday that there are additional resources on the human services side of the ledger in employment supports, and I also indicated pretty clearly, I thought, that if there's additional support needed, I will seek that support. I am not going to cut services to individuals who need them. End of story, Mr. Speaker.
PDD community is disputing the minister's claim that these cuts will lead to more effective services. In fact, Minister, warning that these cuts will set positive changes in the systems back, and I'll quote, further than ever. How can this government possibly excuse trying to find savings off the back of our most vulnerable Albertans? Why are you doing this, Minister?
I also made it abundantly clear, I thought, yesterday, Mr. Speaker, that I'm not looking to seek cost savings. I'm looking to improve a system that is in need of improvement. We can do better, and we're going to do better, Mr. Speaker.
Given that the Premier gave a mandate to the minister asking that Given that the Premier gave a mandate to the Minister asking that he continue to provide support to Albertans in a compassionate and caring manner, can the Minister explain how leaving staff, family and Albertans with developmental disabilities meets his definition of compassionate and care?
I think there was a clause missing in that sentence, Mr. Speaker, or in that question. It didn't quite make sense to me. But as I said, I have been out there in communities across this province, 20 more communities in the next 2 weeks. I'm out talking to people. I'm understanding what their situations are. There is fear and anxiety out there. I freely admit that. I said that yesterday. We're dealing with it. We will have new contracts in place, and we will continue. If you need services, you will get services. End of story.
The Honourable Member Calgary Mountain View, followed by Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today, hundreds of people from across the province with the greatest of life challenges, with courage and sacrifice, came to the legislature to demonstrate their opposition to what this government is doing to persons with disabilities. The government's agenda to cut $42 million from their services risks health and safety and is poorly planned, according to those who happen to know, the individuals themselves and their families and caregivers. This government is compounding its own financial mismanagement with mismanagement of our most vulnerable Albertans. To the Minister, how does this not make a mockery of your much-touted social policy framework? Putting people first, being proactive, showing dignity, collaborating.
Honourable Associate Minister, Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the social policy framework is a very important document, not only a document from government, but from the community, developed through the community. It's important that we address all issues with dignity and compassion and respect, and the Honourable Associate Minister is doing exactly that, working with persons with disabilities and their families to ensure that the services that they need will be there and that they will have what they need to participate in an inclusive way in our society. The fact that we're changing some processes with respect to the Community Access Program and moving to a better model is demonstration of exactly that dignity and respect.
Honourable Member.
Well, Mr. Speaker, an organization called Skills Society Edmonton must eliminate $200,000 per month starting July the 1st. Will the Minister tell us how he would accomplish this without risking health and safety of his clients?
Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is that there are a number of service delivery organizations across the province, and some of them are going to have to change the way they deliver services from the community access services they provide now to the support services that are necessary to ensure true inclusion of their clients in society. And if they cannot make those changes, other organizations will pick up the changes. But the focus, Mr. Speaker, is not on the organizations. The focus is all on the Albertans who need the services and ensuring that they get the services that they need to be truly included in a truly inclusive society.
Honourable Member.
Well, it's clear to most of us in Alberta that this government hasn't really planned well this change. It's too short, it's too drastic. Will the Minister assure this House that he will delay the implementation of these draconian changes?
Honourable Associate Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there is clearly some fear and anxiety out there. I talked yesterday in my statement about it, and some of it, like the skills organization that he raised, some organizations are fearful of the money that they see inside the PDD envelope. They're not looking at money that is outside of that envelope in the human services budget, or, as I said yesterday, if I need additional supports, I get it. I'm out talking to people across this province, and I said yesterday, it's crystal clear. People are concerned about the transition. Not what we're doing, but how we're doing it or how fast we're doing it really is the problem. And they're concerned about funding. I'm working on both of those. We will do a funding transition with people.
Thank you, Honourable Minister. The Honourable Member of Strathcona, followed by Little Bow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The NDP has made a list of the top 10 ways in which this PC government has broken their promise to Albertans with disabilities. 10. Cut basic income supports of up to $280 per month to disabled seniors. 9. Cut disability service program at MRU. 8. Doubled the wait time for AISH. 7. Terminated Alberta's only American Sign Language program. 6. Cut 20% of speech pathologists in Edmonton schools. To the minister in charge of standing up for disabled Albertans, why is this PC government so intent on making Alberta's most vulnerable citizens pay the price of its fiscal incompetence?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that top 10 list might have the spot on David Letterman where people appreciate comedy and fiction. But, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that this government cares about vulnerable people in our society. I laid out a plan, in fact, a few-year plan about the transformations that are needed in this ministry, and that will make sure that if you need service, you will get service in our province, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in this province you can either laugh or you can cry. Given that the fifth way this government is hurting Albertans with disabilities is through a $180 million cut from pharmacy benefits that will see the sickest and most disabled seniors pay the most, and given the fourth way is through a 20% cut to addictions and mental health funding, and the third way is through the elimination of almost half of Calgary's palliative home care nurses, why won't this government stop making Alberta's sick and disabled a target of their cuts?
Speaker, as the honourable member knows, this province has a very proud record of supporting vulnerable people across society, including seniors, including people with addictions and mental health issues, and including many others. Mr. Speaker, to reduce the discussion about such important matters to for lack of a better term, a top 10 line of questioning, Mr. Speaker, does not do justice either to the people involved or to the policy challenges that are in front of us.
Service doesn't give justice either. Given that the number 2 way this government has let down people with disabilities is by closing the Missioner Centre despite promising families that they will not, and given that the number 1 attack on Alberta citizens with disabilities is a $60 million cut from programs that could secure the safety and quality of life for Alberta's citizens with the most severe disabilities, why won't this government admit that in at least 10 different ways their so-called tough choices are always made at the expense of Alberta's most vulnerable citizens?
Well, there's a good example right there, Mr. Speaker. The party in question here has been lobbying for years that we can do better with community living and more inclusive, more engaging ways of addressing the needs of disabled people in our province. And now they're going to protest that we're closing the Missioner Centre. In fact, that is an implementation of a body of research and best practices developed in Alberta and across North America, and we're going to continue with it, Mr. Speaker, because it's the right thing to do.
The Honourable Member for Little Bow.
Students in St. Albert have identified concerns about caring for loved ones that not only adversely affects the quality of life for seniors, but also PDD adults. A retired couple from St. Albert, Ross and Irene Boyce, have a 41-year-old son named Brian. Brian is a developmentally delayed and blind and has always lived at home with his loving parents. The Boyce have searched for weekend respite care for Brian, and although they found agencies that provide respite services, the agency waiting lists are long, and they are finding care is not actually readily available. My first question is to the Associate Minister of Services for Persons with Disabilities. How is respite care administered for seniors with adult PDD children who may have an increased need for relief in their homes?
Honourable Associate Minister.
Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Speaker, and my thanks to the family that came in today. And my hat goes off to people that provide care for their loved ones in their home. And I know the circumstances are difficult, Mr. Speaker. This is actually one of the reasons why the SIS assessment by itself isn't a good predictor of funding and supports necessary. There are circumstances around an individual. Our PDD program does provide for respite care. I don't know if the individuals have actually spoken to the CEO of the PDD network. I invite them to do so immediately or to provide their details. I will work with the MLA on resolving the situation.
Honourable Member. Thank you, Mr. Minister. To the same Minister, we hear staff retention in agencies offering respite care is very hard to maintain due to low wages and challenging work for respite staff. Minister, are we adequately supporting the agencies to hire an appropriate amount of qualified employees?
Honourable Associate Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Disability Service Network out there is probably one of the keys to providing services going forward. We have some 20,000 people providing care in this province, and just unbelievably dedicated and qualified staff. That's why we moved this year to offer a 10% wage increase across the board. Last year, a one-time bonus. We're going to continue to bring their salaries up to parity. We're also working on a workforce alliance to talk about education levels and recruitment and retention tools so that we have a stable workforce going forward.
Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My last question to the same Minister. Does your ministry recognize the many families in this predicament who may not have other supports in place? And if so, is there any specific action the government is taking to put plans for proper relief in place for ageing parents of adult PDD children?
Honourable Minister.
Yes, that's an excellent question, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the MLA for it, and again, the family for coming in today. This is exactly why personal conversations are needed around SIS assessments, so we can understand what personal circumstances are and allocate resources appropriately. I will take this particular case up with the department and the PDD staff. I certainly invite the family to do so with the CEO and with their MLA. We'll do everything we can in this particular case, but on the broader question, it's a very valid one, and I will look at it, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Strathmore Brooks, followed by Strathcona. Sherwood Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government cannot be trusted to care for persons with developmental disabilities. In Strathmore Brooks, the Newell Community Action Group provides a variety of excellent learning opportunities with the Community Access Grant, which are now at risk due to this government's callous restructuring of PDD programming. Some of the programs that may be discontinued include cooking classes, computer training, as well as reading, writing, and math. When will this government acknowledge that they are shortchanging our most vulnerable by slashing programs that provide crucial learning opportunities for persons with developmental disabilities?
We're doing no such thing, Mr. Speaker. We're transforming a PDD system that will allow people to be fully engaged in their community through employment or other opportunities, volunteer work, whatever else. Mr. Speaker, we want to improve the services that we give, not slash them, and that's honourable members wrong.
Given that this government continues to downplay the significance of these cuts, will the Associate Minister for PDD explain how this government has somehow determined that reading, writing and maths instruction, as well as cooking, volunteering, occupational development and other community access programs aren't important?
I don't believe I ever said any such thing, Mr. Speaker, and if the honourable member has some specific examples of programs that are being cut, I would be more than willing to talk to him about it. What I did say yesterday, and holds true today, Mr. Speaker, is no service provider out there has a new contract and is aware of any specific cuts. And there's a lot of fear and anxiety. We're moving to calm that. We're going to provide services that people need, Mr. Speaker, that improve their quality of life. We're going to continue to do that.
Honourable member.
Given that I have received many letters from PDD clients upset about these cuts, as one person states, quote, I feel very upset for what you guys did to us. I feel very upset. I feel it's not fair to us. You should try to walk in our shoes and see how it feels. And given that earlier today the Minister suggested if he has to go back and request more money, he will. Can he please outline exactly how much more money he will be asking for to fulfill his promise that if you need the service, you will get it?
Mr. Speaker, as I said in my statement yesterday, no individual is has been informed that they're getting any cuts to their services either. There is a lot of fear and anxiety out there. If the honourable member is truly concerned about the welfare of any particular individual, then why doesn't he forward that letter to my office, and together we can work on a resolution to it, Mr. Speaker. It does no good to talk about it on the floor of the House.
The Honourable Member Calgary Mountain View, followed by Lac-La-Biche St. Paul Two Hills.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce to you and through you to the rest of the members Nancy Dick and John Ressler from the Disability Action Hall, Ryan Geek from the Calgary Scope Society, and Donna Dunn from the Disability Studies at Mount Royal University, here today to support the protest occurring in the steps of the Legislature and add their voices to calls for this government to reverse its devastating cuts to PDD services. These organizations have had their budgets slashed along with PDDs. The cuts will prevent these organizations from delivering vital frontline services to the developmentally disabled. I'll ask them to rise and receive the welcome of the Legislature.
The Honourable Member.
On this, and I apologize, Mr. Speaker, I actually have a fourth tabling, and this is a letter sent to the Minister of Human Services from a community disability services provider for adults living with developmental disabilities. They are extremely concerned about the cuts to PDD. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And just a reminder, the Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to table 88 postcards, My Face, My Place campaign, asking the Minister to reverse the cuts of PDD. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Are there the Honourable Member for Edmonton Highlands Norwood, Leader of the New Democrat Opposition, rose on a point of order, and so we'll recognize him or someone on his behalf at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising on the point of order in reference to the Standing Order Section 23 HIJ. Mr. Speaker, the comment that was made by the Associate Minister was clearly intentional to create disorder in this House, and quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, was untrue. And so, first and foremost, myself and the members of the Alberta NDP caucus have been having ongoing conversation with organizations, with caregivers, and with people with developmental disabilities for years, Mr. Speaker. In addition to that, the Honourable Associate Minister made a claim that that we were not present at the rally that took place outside, where the member from Edmonton Strathcona, the member from Edmonton Calder, and myself were in attendance at the PDD rally, and speaking with many of the participants, many representatives of organizations, many family members, and adults with developmental disabilities themselves. And so, I'll also add that there were members from all the opposition parties that were at this rally. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Associate Minister to withdraw his incorrect, false, and offensive comments.
Honourable members, there's another point of order on this same point, I believe, from Lac-La-Biche St. Paul. Before we get to that, Associate Minister, yeah, did you want to? Okay, so let's hear the member from Lac-La-Biche St. Paul on this same point. We'll deal with the 2 points of order together, and then we'll recognize the Honourable Associate Minister.
Very briefly, and for my second point of order, I will withdraw that one. So I'd like to just speak to this one here. Again, I rise today in accordance with 23 sub H sub I sub J. Often in this legislature, we have a different opinion, or we have different interpretations of facts. What the Associate Minister of PDD here did, though, is make a statement that was completely and utterly untrue. And whether that was deliberate or not, the consequences are the same. And that's what gives rise to this point of order. His comments were with respect to attendance at rallies with respect to PDD. And I think it's uncategorically true that members from our caucus, I understand Calgary Shaw, Medicine Hat, as well as other members of other caucuses, the Leader of the Official Opposition, and I believe the member from Edmonton, Beverly Clareview, and perhaps others from his caucus, did attend that. And what is clear is that we are listening. This is a very serious issue. Cuts to PDD is very, very serious. One aspect I would like to mention, though, is that there is a precedent in this House that we are not to refer to the absence or presence of a member in this Assembly. And along that same principle, although it's not a hard and fast rule, I think this should be applied here, that the member should not be speaking about the absence or presence of an individual at a certain event outside, particularly when it's completely untrue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Associate Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm somewhat amused that I'm being called on a question of order that something that I've said offends sensibilities in the House, creates, in fact, disorder, in part by the honourable member who interrupted me so much that I had to not deliver an answer today. Nonetheless, Mr. Speaker, I would point out that I didn't say the honourable members opposite weren't present at the rally. I said I did not see them in the crowd talking to individuals, and that is actually the truth, Mr. Speaker. I did not see them. However, Mr. Speaker, I endeavour not to create disorder in this House. I endeavour to uphold its fine traditions. I withdraw an offending remark unreservedly, reservedly.
Thank you. The Associate Minister has withdrawn his comments, and it'll be noted as such, and we'll move on then. The last